Good evening and welcome back to Clergy Round Table at Naples United Church of Christ in Naples, Florida, or as we like to say, Paradise. My name is Dawson Taylor. I have the great privilege of serving as senior minister, and I say welcome back because the last time we were together in this venue was, I believe it was November, correct? Because we didn't do it
October,
in
November.
November, because we didn't do it during Advent. And so I say welcome back because we're excited to be back. This is our first in our, what we're calling our Lenten Clergy Round Table. And our format is slightly different. We voted someone off the island. Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris Ewing retired. And actually, I'm fortunate to say that I got the opportunity to have lunch with her recently. She's doing great and is getting to spend wonderful time with grandchildren and her spouse and doing wonderfully well. And I know she actually misses Angela the most, but it was nice to be a nice runner up to that. And but she's doing really well. And so as Angela and I joked when thinking about Clergy Roundtable, as brilliant as we think we both are and as interesting as we think we both are, we could not envision a format for Clergy Roundtable where the two of us just sat and visited together, because we do that on our own, but we couldn't imagine that people would actually tune into that. And so actually, I want to make sure credit is given where it is due, and that is Angela helped really reframe and rethink a new format, which I think is going to be really fantastic. I'm really excited about. And so without further ado, I want to welcome and introduce guests and co-host with me, and that is my dear friend and trusted colleague, Reverend Angela Wellsbean, who is Minister for Congregational Care. It's good to see you, my friend.
Good to be back.
And part of how we have changed our format is that each week during this 4-week series during Lent, we are going to be inviting different guests to the table. Some of those guests will be with us in person. Some of those guests will be with us virtually. But what we want to do is invite people to the table to share their professional expertise and knowledge and experience, but also their personal experiences, because what we want to look at in the coming weeks are some of the issues around dying well, or the issues that come up with those transitions that happen in our lives. And we recognize that those aren't always the fun cocktail party conversations that we choose, but we also recognize that they're really important conversations that especially people of faith need to have and should be having, and we want to figure out ways to empower them. And so one of the vehicles that we're using to empower those conversations is the book Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End by Atul Gawande. Dr. Gawande is a real underachiever. He has degrees from Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School of Public Health. This is his fourth book. His previous books include Complications, Better, and the Checklist Manifesto. He's also a MacArthur Fellow and has won numerous prizes and fellowships. And so it seems appropriate, especially with the subtitle Medicine and What Matters in the End, that we wanted to invite a physician to join us to help set the stage really for a lot of this dialogue that we'll be having in the coming weeks. And so I'm personally thrilled to welcome one of our church members who is currently co-chairing our stewardship committee, as well as serving on the board of mission and outreach. And so actually both Angela and I, he serves in both our ministry areas, me working with stewardship and Angela working with board of mission and outreach. But he's also a former board of deacon member, and I probably can't even remember all of the other things that Bob and Candy do in the life of this great church. But Dr. Bob Nordland is with us. And Bob, we're so grateful to have you.
Thank you very much.
With
both of you.
us.
Welcome.
Angela.
And welcome to Clergy Round Table. So you're our guinea pig. So no pressure, but if this doesn't go well, then our whole plan is off for the next 4 weeks.
It's
But
all your fault, right?
right, yeah, we'll just blame Angela. No,
Angela,
no.
right.
No,
And
so,
we're really looking to you to carry this conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Dawson and I are doing our
You're in
best,
trouble.
but
Right.
medicine is not our forte. So
Okay.
well,
I'll try.
as we like to say, sometimes when dealing with some pastoral care issues, we'll say, well, when we went out or was snuck out and went to medical school, but you actually did. And so actually, I'm just a quick, look. You so you went to Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, which. Oh, actually, yeah, we recently had some new members from Wisconsin, but not Appleton. You went to medical school in, it's the Medical College of Wisconsin,
Right.
but it was Marquette at the time. And then you did your residency at University of Minnesota.
Correct.
And you are a licensed OBGYN. And actually, we were talking before we went live with the recording that you're still licensed.
Yeah, I decided to keep up my license so I could still teach and do some
Yeah.
things back in Minnesota.
Yeah, so you're still teaching medical
at
students.
least working with medical students. We
Right.
had a really fun program when we started the practice in 1975 that part of the thing was the students weren't getting enough experience out in the community. And so by trying to expand that, a number of us got together and set up rotations where they could spend their third and fourth years as medical students, and 6 weeks of that in an OBGYN practice around the community.
That's right,
And
yeah.
then also residents who were doing some research and so on could even spend longer. So we had a really nice deal when I started with just another person and started to practice from scratch. We needed new partners, so we'd take the best of the medical students or the best of the residents, and they became partners in our practice.
Yeah, so you had your own training ground.
That's right, yeah.
Well, and one of the many things I respect and appreciate about you, Bob, is that when I first got to know you, you were a volunteer physician with the Senior Friendship Health Clinic, which I know the Naples clinic is closed, but I know that you're still involved with them. And then one of my favorite stories is that Bob and I served on the Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida board of directors together. I still serve on that board. Bob has rotated off. But one of my favorite stories is my first board meeting. Bob was very gracious and offered to take me to the board meeting with him. And so we did. It was an overnight board meeting. And then on the way back, there was this horrific car accident that literally shut down 75.
Right.
And so I think it was like 3 hours we were stuck on
Right.
75. And let's just say we both had to use the restroom so badly. And
I drove on the shoulder.
I was going to say, I wasn't going to confess all our sins,
Yeah.
but it was one of those things that we thought this wreck will never get cleared because we both just had to use the restroom so badly. That's just one of my favorite stories of being stuck on 75 with you.
Yeah.
But no, again, I'm so grateful for you being here because Atul Gawande, who again is a physician, and we were again talking before we went live that from what we can tell, we think he's a trauma surgeon. But and I honestly don't remember if he's still practicing, and I didn't look that up. I don't think he is. I don't know when he would have time to. But.
Yeah, it looked like I looked up a little bit of his bio. It looks like he's involved with a lot of boards and
Right.
and medical leadership and so on in Boston.
Yeah,
and
and
horses riding, and he's got
Yeah,
political-
and running an NGO and
global.
yeah, a
NGO.
global NGO. Yeah,
That's
I
right.
mean,
In his spare
time.
And I think he was more of a trauma surgeon.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Right.
Yeah, and so, but I mean, he comes at this with some really remarkable insights. And part of, again, what we want to do over the next 4 weeks is really frame some of these conversations around theological questions as well. One of the other reasons we want to invite others to the table, Bob, is to also broaden the conversation that we each bring personal experience to these conversations. Times that either professionally or personally, we've helped what I say walk the journey of transitioning from this life to the next. Walked the journey of helping parents make decisions or friends or others make those decisions of when it's time to perhaps move from the primary home to assisted living or a CRCC or, some of those types of decisions. And then also I remember you and I talked some when we were setting this up about, I can only imagine the kinds of conversations you've had as a physician with patients, and obviously in the field of OBGYN and obstetrics, dealing with the difficult conversations you've had with parents to be, people who thought they were going to be parents. I mean, so I'm just wondering about some of that, if you might speak to that, just as we kind of get started.
Let's see, do you have an hour and a half?
Well, I was going to say, I know, and then I have this
Well, with
wonderful.
Dawson's long intro, we have about 45 minutes. Go ahead.
No. It is. It really
Then my
is
long-winded
interesting.
question.
Now, there parts of that there, even personal experiences in my own family, and that type of thing, and dealing with end of life decision making, as well as I was explaining earlier when Dawson and I talked about my doing this, is that in obstetrics, there's also the fetal deaths, the twin demise, fetal, they call it fetal wastage, a mad name, but pregnancy loss and so on that occurs that is so traumatic for so many people. So you could be dealing with not only the patient or the person themselves, but you could be dealing with the circumstances around that, the one child that they'd always wanted and so on, and suddenly is passed and so on in a traumatic situation. And some of those people I know, following some of them later on, it's a real difficult thing to ever let go of. They carry it on for many, many years. If that second twin passes, for example, and the first one made it, and the guilt and, and all that kind of stuff that the parents will go through sometimes at that. But I guess just one of the kind of background things that was kind of funny in a way, but it became more serious in my own family. The reason I went into medicine, I had a lot of cousins and relatives that were doctors. So it was kind of, I don't have to do it, but I got a chance in pre-med to scrub in and see what medicine was all about. So I really enjoyed it, and that's what I wanted to do. And so while I was still in my medical school training, my dad being a little bit older than my mother, we were always being taught, for example, that you always have to tell a patient everything if they have cancer and everything else. And another thing about telling somebody bad news is if you just walk out of the operating room or walk out of anything, and I carried this throughout my whole practice, if the first word you bring up is the big C word, cancer, this is it, most people just blank out. From that moment on, they don't hear anything else. So you do have to come out with thinking it through carefully, your whole team, your medical students, whoever, if they're coming together, just so you have a plan. How are we going to approach this with that particular personality? Well, anyway, so it goes into the practice that way. But in my mother's case, she grew up a Christian Scientist, and you don't know this story, but then she switched over to Congregationalism, Plymouth Church in Minneapolis, all that stuff. So it carried a background. So when I was in med school and away from home, and my dad had some stomach problems that they just didn't want to tell me about there. Oh, don't worry me, I'm in final exams, whatever it was. And all of a sudden I get a call where your dad just came out of surgery. They did find some cancer in his stomach, but don't worry, they think they got it all, but we're not going to tell Dad. And I said, what? I said, I've been here in med school. You always tell the patient. You always tell the relative. You just can't do this. And so I was really distraught. And I was, 6-7 hours away and said, I got to get home. No. And then the ultimatum was, but if you tell your dad, I'll never speak to you again. I'll disown you. And my mother, we had a great relationship, but this is my mother was really dramatic. So I said, we're going to be home in 6 weeks and this and that and so on. We got to talk more about this, but okay. It turned out he had a good surgeon, happened to be one of my relatives, and they thought they got it all. I talked to him, so I thought it was okay. But the worst part kind of goes that when I got back, I accepted her wishes, which I didn't think so, but at least we thought we're okay. So about 3 or 4 years go by, and then he comes back with a major concern. We didn't know what it was. And in dealing with this, I explained to my mom, now he has to know, because he won't even want to go back in and be looked into. He had a lot of complaints. I could feel his liver was enlarged. Stuff was not good, and that we really should do something about it. Well, she finally let me tell him, which is kind of interesting, because this is a case where he said, well, I'm kind of glad I had those 4 years. And, he wasn't so mad at me or anybody else, which I was surprised for not knowing. I thought I
also find it interesting that you were the one that delivered the news.
I know, and she said, well, you'll have to tell him. Well, we had a powwow, and being an only son, I had sat down, and an only child, and we talked about it. And now, Dad, you've got to go into the hospital. There's some tests we got to do, and this and that. And so you just aren't going to, but we could maybe do some good things. So he agreed and went on. But what is interesting in that workup, they couldn't really find back in those days the real diagnosis without an operation, exploratory laparotomy, they call it, an opening procedure. And I tried to explain how important that would be. And he said, well, only I'll do it if you're willing to come in and scrub in and be in the operating room with me. Well, by this time I was in my residency, almost chief resident of the OB department thing, but you know, it's an unusual thing to not only scrub in another case, but also on your own father. Well, turned out the surgeon, again, a relative of mine, said, "I'd love to have you here," and that'd be great. So it really meant a lot to him. We went down to the OR holding hands, went into the case, and as soon as he was opened, it was just obvious he was full of cancer. And now, and the only good thing, it showed later, it was a separate cancer. It wasn't the original one, but it was a separate one that was now pancreatic, which can go all over the place. But anyway, and so on. But the fact that I was there, held his hand, and because these people get such a liver problem and hepatic coma can occur, he didn't even wake up really to be alert after the anesthetic. So like less than 12 hours after starting the case, he was recovering. We stayed with him for a while. We had to take our 2 kids home and come back later, but my mother was there and he passed. But the interesting thing, I've told this in our book club, is that my mother described this experience because she was alone after being there for hours and we had to take the kids. Anyway, my mother said, "I've never seen anything like this." He was in the room alone, sleeping, and she thought he was still trying to recover and sleeping, but hadn't come conscious yet. And all of a sudden, there was a whoosh of air that went through the hospital room. She felt like the shades and everything were rattling and so on, and the windows rattled. And all of a sudden, she woke up and looked up, and this amazing fragrance was going on. And she called the nurses immediately, determined that he had passed. But she called me immediately and told me the story, and I came down and we'll be with her. So the story was like she felt his soul, or you know, the energy had just left his body at the time. So it's, you know, good and bad and terrible things happen. And it's many years ago now, but it was really an experience to go through. So when I deal with my own patients or whatever it is, I mean, you can't help but in medicine come from it from a point of view of where you have been as well. And even that Christian Science thing, I kind of could write it off. When patients are drug seeking and pushing, I need this and I need that, you know, I'd say, well, I come from a family, we don't believe in too many drugs.
Right, exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
I could get them off my back easier. And the same with obstetrical, you know, in obstetrics, you have to be careful all the medication you can give that could also harm the baby. You know, there's two kids and what you've been through, Angela, and all that. So I had to be the bad guy sometimes about, let's just weigh how important this medication is, but we have to look at the safety of the baby or the safety of other things, and it worked pretty well.
I just so appreciate that really powerful story about your father's passing.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the things that we're going to try to, or at least work to demystify as best we can, or it's not that we're just going to magically demystify it in 4 weeks, but at least talk about it, is that I think there's a hesitancy in our culture and in churches we don't want to talk about death.
Right.
And it's the great enemy, the bad person that we all run from.
The Grim Reaper.
The Grim Reaper, literally, you know, and so
Scary.
Scary and fearful and fear-filled. And so I think, and I've experienced some amazingly powerful moments that I can only describe as intimate and peaceful as a pastor when I've been with people, and I know Angela's experienced similar things that just, you know, it doesn't mean that there's not so much grief and pain around that and things, but there's just also some of those really just those really special moments. You know, in the First Testament, Moses sees the burning bush and he knows that it's holy ground, and he takes his shoes off. And I think to myself, I don't necessarily know or fully understand what's happened, but this is holy ground. Like, we should be taking our shoes off, kind of moment. And I just think about that with your father's passing, or the way you've told that story. And, you know, I'm hopeful that we'll capture more of those kinds of stories that help us demystify some of what happens around death.
Right.
Because, I don't know, I mean, maybe it's...
Yeah, I have had the privilege of accompanying not an insignificant amount of people at the end of life, and holding vigil with them and their families, and having been there when they died. And a family member that I was present with was my maternal grandfather. But those were all good deaths.
Yeah.
They were all people who had either lived really long and full lives and it was their time to die, or they were people who, if they were younger, had had a very long terminal illness and that their death was going to bring a measure of relief to them and their families. I have not had the opportunity, and I don't really want to say privilege, to be present at the death of someone in which it's unexpected, or it's traumatic, or it's at the hands of violence. Like, I'm thinking, like, I never had seen someone get shot in front of me,
Right.
for example. And so, and I, that's one thing that he talks about in this book, is like how to die well, and to be present at that is a powerful experience and a privilege. Like, comes with our profession, but a lot of people don't have that opportunity, and I think that contributes to our societal fear of death, because a lot of people just aren't exposed to it in that way. And then for people who are I'm especially thinking of like the medical profession, that see awful, tragic, traumatic deaths all the time, like, whether it was like a surgery in which say maybe the person coded on the operating table, or something, violent, then then it's like that also precipitates this negative association with death.
It is interesting. In the field of OB/GYN, like I was saying before, I did a lot of surgery, and some of it was cancer surgery. The real extended, long-term chemos and radiation, all the combinations of things, would frequently and would go on to oncologists, and many times they would be the primary doctor at the end and so on. But in just dealing with that and preparing that, but occasionally, even in my training, I'll never forget one time an older physician was just removing a breast lump, and it was near the room that I was working in my training days, doing a gynecologic hysterectomy or something. And all of a sudden, the patient coded, and just as you said, a traumatic, sudden situation, and we all rushed in to help this person do CPR and do everything, and the patient was lost and so on. And it was, it was one of my earlier experiences in my medical training, but to see that happen so suddenly, and then also the physician was just really emotionally wiped out, not expecting that. And like I said, he was an older physician having to deal with that. And there are others where I've been in the operating room and they needed help immediately when aneurysms will rupture. That's a really tough one.
Yeah.
And I was finishing a case, and the general surgeon yelled for help, and we just all came in to help him on a really tough ruptured aneurysm, and the person died. Of course, those used to die all the time, and now it's better. But things like that will happen so suddenly, and it's different. Then you're dealing with a family that didn't expect this, and it's different. So right.
Bob, I have a question for you. I'm thinking about you being an OB/GYN, and it seems to me that people who go to your general practitioner, or even any kind of specialist, for the vast majority of our lives, we're going to the doctor when something's wrong, something hurts, something's not right. We need diagnostic testing because they think something might be amiss. But an OB/GYN is like, maybe the only example I can think of is when someone wants to start a family, and they got that positive pregnancy test and they're excited, or maybe they're starting their IVF journey. And it's like one of the few times where we really want to go to the doctor to get that confirmation, validation of the pregnancy we're hoping for. But then it occurred to me that I can only imagine, I'd like for you to flesh this out more. It seems to me that in the course of one day, you could have experienced the gamut of emotions, from that joy and elation to fear. Or maybe you're confirming a pregnancy that someone didn't want, that doesn't want to have, and now they're in a moment of crisis, or having to deliver bad news, that a pregnancy is ending, or that, or that the pregnancy isn't viable, or, as you mentioned, like infant twin loss. And it's just like, what is it like, having everything from joy and affirming a family's dreams to offering them potentially the worst news of their lives, and I can't, like, in one day.
Yeah, that's. I've heard some people say we're kind of showmen, or having to put on various different hats or emotions when we're dealing with so many different changes throughout the whole day. And I remember even just as a little scout, and I can't remember if it was Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts, whatever it was, we took a tour of a hospital, and the leader happened to be my neighbors. They were a Lutheran minister family, by the way. She was leading this group of Cub Scouts, I guess it was, and we entered the hospital, and she said, hospitals are really really a sad, sad place. It's so many bad things that can happen. And then we went by the little newborn nursery and pointing out all the little babies and how much fun it is. And so that kind of carried over with me when I was really wanting to do surgery. I just loved the OR. I don't know why, but anyway, long story, I guess. But so I really wanted to be a surgeon. But when I was in the naval base in Vietnam thing going on in Chicago, Great Lakes Naval Hospital for a while, I talked to a lot of general surgeons saying, how did they like their practice? And he said, well, it's always kind of a downer and this and that and so on. And I thought, but in OB, you've got the fun part of it. So I thought, I can do surgery, the gynecologic part and so on, and help infertility and cancer stuff too, and just hysterectomies that are not always cancers, but have the fun of that, but also the joy of a newborn baby that just popped out, or like you say, being told.
It just pops right out, Bob.
Yeah, I know.
Pops out.
Doesn't always. yeah, that's right. It doesn't always pop right
And
out.
please don't give started those stories. I've heard those stories.
I know. But the idea being that it's such an exciting moment, and every newborn that you hold is just a gift of joy and a miracle. Really, you're holding a miracle in your hands, and you're the first one. Although we worked out deals where husband could be part of the involved delivery, or the mom would reach over and help deliver, so they got to touch the baby first, and all these kind of things to make it really personal to the family, and that was what was fun. But it did balance out your day. But then you'd go from that to go in and tell somebody, well, the ultrasound looks like it has passed. You have a stillborn, or and the up and down of telling them they have cancer and how to do this. So it was a real balance and a real circus. But there was one person who trained me in my rotation where I got 6 months of just doing surgery only as part of my 4-year rotation. And this guy was the most popular guy. Everybody loved him. And I was so glad I could train with him. But we rushed from one place to another. The emergency room was bad. The ectopic pregnancy was going on. We'd have to rush in and do a delivery and everything. But we'd come in to make rounds in front of a patient that was dying of cancer or some problem that she had. So we'd come in and I'd just follow along, and he'd walk in and immediately stop the rushed pace. As soon as the door opened and we'd walk in, he relaxed and calmed down and sat down and held her hand. And he pretended that he had all the time in the world, which he had no time in the world. But he gave that impression so well to the patient. It was so soothing and calming to that patient that I thought, gee, someday I'd really like to be able to do that. Yeah. And that's a hard thing to do. But if you can do it, so each person really means the most to you at that moment, and nobody else is going to, well, you do it when you talk.
We're trying, Bob.
Yeah.
We can relate to that.
People are at you at the
we
end
have
of the
all
service.
the time in the world for every parishioner.
Exactly.
Right,
Do you have any idea of how many babies you've delivered?
Well, one time we tried to add it up, and if you get into all the training years and places where there'd be deliveries in the hallways and all over and so on, there are thousands and thousands.
I didn't know we had to include hallways, but if we include hallways,
I looked at Cook County to train down there, and they really were delivering in the hallways. So I stayed at Milwaukee County for a while, and then went to my residency.
But,
got to
but
do that.
Thousands.
Yeah, thousands. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I did that.
That has to be amazing.
Right.
No, I mean, and this is getting back to some of the earlier conversations about those moments of where, the language that Atul Gawande uses is when things fall apart. And that's actually the second chapter title. And there's a point there where he says, and I'm taking a little bit out of context here, but he writes, we eventually fall apart and the medical field doesn't know how to address this. And I don't see that as an indictment of medicine. Actually, in some ways it's complimentary because I think it must be a part of medical training. I mean, doctors, nurses, technicians, across the medical field, that you are taught to do everything in your power to empower life and empower things, if you will, moving forward. And then when, as he says, things fall apart, when I say the wheels fall off, what is that like as a physician? Is it, I would imagine, as I like to say, in my healthy moments, I recognize those things happen, but are there moments where you feel like you've let the patient down, or perhaps they try to project that onto you? Or, I mean, what is that like?
Yeah, well, in so many different ways. You can take it like his book is also medicine and what matters in the end, and ideas of dignity and dying with dignity or and that kind of thing. So the end of life type of thing. But you can also take it just if something tragically went wrong. If you lose a baby for some particular reason, and I can just bring that up. Well, the one thing too about our training, it's so much in medical school that you try to do everything possible, and it's almost like you're being defeated if cancer or the disease beats you, and you take it personally too. You can't what did we do wrong? Why didn't we do this or that? But also let's keep trying more and more and more. And that's where it's so important. And I'm so glad you're doing this roundtable on such an important book. We left ours in Minnesota, so I had glanced at it this summer. But anyway, so I'm catching up too. But the book is so important to bring in these issues because people do have rights nearing the end about how far do they want you to go with this? How long are you going to pressure trying this, trying that? Do you want to try some new experimental? Do you want to be on that protocol that you might get the placebo or the real medication? So the involvement of really including not only the patient and their family, but really making a conjoined decision helps the doctor. But there is that drive you want to always keep, well, we could try this, we could do that, we go a little bit further. But I was going to say, even in the obstetrical part of it, if you have a difficult thing where a mother has a seizure during a delivery or something's happening, years ago when they didn't allow family, and especially the father, in the delivery room, something bad could happen. And you'd come walking out and say, well, this didn't go so well and this and that. And immediately everybody assumes it's got to be perfect. There's not going to be a problem. So they're mad at you. They're mad at everybody. I think lawsuits, I do work to try and help avoid lawsuits.
I was going to say, I didn't mention that earlier, but you still actively consult to lower malpractice.
Yeah, we work on ways to avoid problems. And actually, Atul Gawande wrote a book that was kind of a neat one. It's based on the Boeing airline thing. I think it's called Checklist. And it's based on airline industry of everything being checked off. Well, we have what we call timeout in the operating room. So every time you're starting a case before the patient's put to sleep even, is this the right patient? You identify everything. What are we going to be doing? Which organ and which side and what are we actually going after? You check off everything and to try and cut down any problems like that. But if something goes wrong and you come out without there being seeing what's happened, it's hard sometimes for them to accept it. I noticed right away if we have there's a thing called preeclampsia where you get high blood pressure, toxemia is another word for it, and eventually you can even have a seizure. Well, sometimes it comes so fast that a mother can have a seizure and so on. But if I've had it where the husband was in the room and we're attending to the baby and doing this, that, and so on, all of a sudden he says, I think she's passing out here or something. He could see right away. We gave the drugs, we did everything, we brought the mom around. But to have him see it and know we did our very best instead of sitting there and arguing or worrying and arguing, well, did you try this or did that or what happened? Really, the mystery is taken out of it if they can be involved, and that really helps a lot. But it gets to so many different things of how far you carry it, and we. And another thing, maybe I'm going too far here, but there was a OB/GYN doctor that people didn't realize was an OB/GYN doctor named Dr. Jack Kevorkian, and they used to call him Dr. Death and so on. Okay, so
because he's a pioneer in physician-assisted suicide, correct?
That's exactly right. Okay. Yeah, and the euthanasia idea and so on, and so in many states they've set up some things and so on to do that and so on. But he actually had instruments that we used to use in the operating room for DNCs or curettaging and doing things like that. But his interest was coming from an OB/GYN point of view, seeing how many difficult things can go on to that death decision time and how involved the person should be or could be involved and what's best for them. And I know just a personal situation, and Candy said it's okay to talk about her mother, but her mother got to a point where she was just really, really ill with a chronic obstructive lung problem in her 80s and so on, and just did not want to continue living. And they kept pushing her, oh, you can do this, you can do that, and they were trying, and they weren't really very accepting. She wasn't in a hospice thing yet, and that's probably another point. You're going to have a hospice person, and that's very, very important. But in any case, she just basically said, so what? Screw it. I'm gonna just quit eating, and I'm not gonna eat anymore.
Right.
And she did it. And I was just talking to a good friend of ours who was attorney in our wedding and stuff the other day about his understanding of end-of-life decision-making and so on. And he was telling me about his father-in-law did the very same thing just fairly recently, that it's one way you don't have to go through all these sign off that, is this illegal in the state and so on. The patient just says, I'm going to do it, and you don't have to give them lots of drugs and everything too. So just stopping eating is another way to
nourishment.
do it. Right. Exactly. Right.
Well, I think this idea of people feeling empowered, because again, actually, this is a great segue to go back to the first chapter, which I did a masterful job of skipping over, of this idea of independence. Atul Gawande sets the stage about, this idea that we are innately very independent people, and we don't like the idea of not being anything but independent. But I don't know, this was a couple weeks ago. I'd read this article, or I listened to a podcast. It was likely a podcast, but I kind of burst into Angela's office, and I'd had this big epiphany, and she's kind of like, welcome to the party, Dawson. Everyone knows this. But there's a burgeoning...
I have no idea where he's going with this.
I know this is. I kind of want to see how long I can draw this out to see. About death doulas. We were talking about because Angela had been advising a church member in my presence about suggesting to their daughter, who's about to have their first child, to get a doula for the birthing process.
I hope Bob likes doulas.
Yeah.
I'm a super fan.
Yeah, they're good, and as long as they don't supplant the husband. See, I had doulas that wanted to be the big show, and I'm in there with Mom, and I'm running the show, and
it's kind of like wedding planners.
I would drive the husband out and say, "Wait a minute, this is your wife. This is your situation. Don't get pushed out of the picture here." So that was my.
Doulas need to know their place.
They need to know.
It's kind of how I feel about wedding planners. Anyway,
right.
And so, but this idea that it's a coach or a professional who helps empower the dying process and helps the patient or the individual advocate for themselves about what they want or don't want in the dying process. But again, kind of demystifying and taking away or attempting to take away the scariness and the what doesn't work and what can't be in the dying process. Right. And I just had this huge epiphany, and Angela's like, yes, Dawson, everyone knows about these. No. But I mean, it was just, I was so interested in this. But again, this idea of maintaining that autonomy, this independence that Gawande writes about, and I think you're alluding to as well, that I think we so often want to project onto people, well, this is what I want or what I think you want for the end of life process or that transition time. And so we take away people's independence. And our natural reaction when our independence is taken away, when you're backed into a corner, is you fight or you press outward. Right. And it takes away that, independence. And so I'm continually struck as we begin this dialogue about dying well and that's throughout medical decision making at every level.
And I mean, on that same note, I can't believe that your dad, well, I guess in the end it turned out to be okay because he wasn't bothered by the fact that he didn't know he had cancer for 4 years. But to me, that sent my medical ethics alarm bells off.
Me too.
Because it's like the patient should have all the information so they can make the decisions.
And it was exactly when I was being taught that in med school. I had gone through the pre-med. I was halfway through med school. And then my mom also tells me doing just the opposite of what I knew we had to do. It was crazy, but it goes on. One of the things that I also had a fun chance to do when I first started into my practice, we were quite involved with the church in Minneapolis, and the youth group was dealing with some of these issues, death and dying and so on. So I led one of the retreat deals on death and dying using Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying. And I didn't realize how old that book, it was written in 1969. I was kind of looking it up the other night when you asked me to do this. But anyway, and I came across that and the stages of going through dying and where you then can fit in the ministry and all those kind of things, because there is the natural steps where they start with isolation and denial.
I was going to say, I was just thinking okay, this is like a seminary test.
Okay. So I looked him up here.
Thank you.
Okay. But anyway, so there's the denial, isolation is kind of considered one.
Denial.
And then you get into moving on to anger. And then bargaining.
Yep.
And then you have depression. And then acceptance. Now, what's interesting is some people go through step, step, step. Others
Right.
just jump all around in
Yep.
various places, and you hope they're going to get to acceptance. But this is the kind of thing that I think in medicine, clergy, all the counseling, our wonderful Stephen ministers and all these things
Right.
are dealing with all the time. Of where are people in those steps as you visit people in hospice or wherever they are, and where you can understand that they're going to be mad or they're going to be trying to, well, if I only had done this or that, and second guessing them or their doctors, whatever.
Well,
too.
our grief group, I'm running an 8-week grief group right now, and this is our last week, and all of these things have come up in terms of in the grief process of grieving a lost loved one.
Right.
Did she, toward the end of her life, or did I dream this? Did she start looking at or researching a sixth step, or did I?
Well, I think some people separated those first two because I thought
Oh, is
there
that
was two
what
in
it
the
was?
beginning because she
Okay.
had denial and
Maybe-
isolation. And,
maybe that was her.
and
her
she put
work.
those two into one at first
Okay.
in the original book, I think.
So
But
I
then-
think
yeah,
maybe that's
yeah,
what it was. Is
yeah.
that? So again, I think these, because I talk about this clearly, not with too much expertise since I couldn't list them on my own, but these steps of grief, because that's what you're saying, Bob. I always say to people, you might work through them in a linear fashion, or you might skyrocket through them all at once, and then work your back way down through them, and then you might go through 3 and come back. It's not necessarily a linear process, but to me, when I began to grasp that, and like you say, her original work, 1969, but it was groundbreaking.
It was. They had
And-
the 50th edition just came out, a
Yeah,
few years ago
and-
now. Now they got many more about that.
And and to my knowledge, there has not been work that has undone what her foundational work is. And
She's
it's
quite a psychologist.
exactly. So this idea of denial, isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, it's very powerful. And I think a helpful tool for people to understand this is potentially what I am experiencing. It doesn't mean that everyone experiences it. It doesn't mean everyone goes through them in necessarily in those orders. But again, like you say, that idea of getting to the acceptance
Yeah,
ultimately.
That's
And, we've seen people as they go through those phases, I've seen people get to acceptance more quickly than I anticipated, and then I've
I
seen
think
people.
it's changed a lot. And then when you add hospice and various ways that for both the family and the person knowing that they're not going to be suffering, that
Right.
there's ways to make this work so you're not going to suffer.
I even think this list can apply not only after the person's died, not only after they've been given a terminal diagnosis, but I think so often we look over the milestone of when we realize, or when our doctors help us realize, or our family helps us realize, that we're no longer the independent person that we've been our whole lives, and that we're no longer capable of existing on our own without external support, and how this list applies to that, and the denial. I'm fine.
Yeah.
I
Right.
just fell.
Yeah, right.
Not a big deal. And then anger, over the sense of powerlessness, and then bargaining, and then of course feeling depressed over, again, not even being able to be our independent selves we've been for so long, especially in the United States, in a society which places such as a high value and premium on independence.
Right.
And then getting to the point of acceptance. And I think that families and the person themselves can go through this either, one or the other, or together. And it can be just as hard for a family to accept that my mom, this person that has always cared for me, suddenly, I need to care for her. It can be, just as important for them to go through that process as the person themselves, and then making the decisions of even before we get to the end of life decisions, there's so many other steps that happen before that, and making sure the person still has that control over their lives.
I kind of laugh about that because having the fact that this was my dad's situation, where the only reason we knew he might have another problem is he was out mowing the lawn at the tender age of 82 with a hand push mower and bumped against a fence, and he thought he broke a rib or did something, and in checking it out, it was cancer that was into the rib area. But we had to then confront him about, this is more significant than just a little rib, let's check it out. But that was his independence. He wanted to be out mowing the lawn at that age.
And just so we're clear, before Bob and Candy sold their home up north, that would not have been how we found it with Bob,
That would not.
Right.
because it's Candy that mowed mowed the yard,
Oh, yeah.
not Bob. So just so that's on.
I didn't know that was coming up here.
Well, I
She'd
didn't know I
love
was
the
gonna-
ride or more. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
And what if you, I'm just thinking, hypothetically speaking, Bob, what if, back then you had to do exploratory surgery to find out that it was cancer, but nowadays with all the arthroscopic
Yeah.
stuff they can do, say you had been able to find out that your dad was riddled with cancer, of course you have the conversation with him and he says, what if he says, I don't want treatment. My quality of life, as long as I am able to mow my lawn, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that's what,
Yeah, that's the measuring stick.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
exactly right. I think
being able to have that
I
conversation.
don't think it would have changed, anything except maybe a little better goodbye and so on. I was able to be there, but my mom, well, she said goodbye on the way down the OR, and then I was there too. But you're right. The idea that I think back then we wanted to be more specific. Is it something that could even be helped at all within
Yes.
any
Yeah.
approach? And
Yeah.
and we just, it was just a different deal where you
Yeah,
can get better
absolutely.
diagnoses now and then make better plans too. So
Yeah.
that's true.
I think, as usual, you raise such an interesting and important point, and I wonder. I want to ask this on a secondary level is, so this idea that you talked about with like the grieving, that we go through our own potential grieving process of like the aging, like I'm aging or my parents is aging, or we're kind of grapple with that. Do you think that that's what I would call anticipatory grief about my loved one is going to die?
one step closer to death.
Right. One step closer to death, or I'm one step closer to death, or, it is I just think about how much money Americans spend. I don't have the number, about, to really
Rejuvenate.
disguise. Yeah. We're going to rejuvenate this body part or that
right,
body
that's
part,
right.
or,
Yeah.
whatever, we rejuvenate a lot, and so I just think about, again, tying this to this idea that we don't like to talk about or acknowledge that death is the ultimate decider, equalizer, et cetera. I don't know. You just had me thinking there for a second that is that we don't want to talk about that grieving process because we don't really want to talk about.
Because we know what comes after.
Yeah, because we
it.
know what the
Yes.
next grieving
Yes.
process might be, or,
And I'm glad that you brought up the way that we idolize youth, especially in, appearance, and billions and billions of dollars are spent every year, especially by women and companies marketing to women to, look younger. And there's this taboo around asking a woman how old she is. And Gawande writes, especially in the first chapter, a lot about how in other societies, elders are revered and
Right.
held in a place of prominence
His
and
India
importance.
experience, yeah, that was very good.
And this idea that you would sequester or outsource your
Right.
elders' care,
Right.
and just kind of put them in a home is just unconscionable in
Right.
communities where this person is revered, like a living library and held in great esteem for their wisdom. And Gawande writes, nowadays you don't have to go to the elder for information because you can go to Google and what does he say? Any computer breaks, you ask the teenager to fix
right.
it.
Right,
He's like,
right.
Seniors have become obsolete, and I think that's all wrapped up in our obsession with looking young, and
Right.
so
looking,
not
acting, feeling.
yes.
Yeah, I mean.
Right.
So
Yeah, I've noticed that. I remember, I'm so much older than you two by a long shot. And so when I look back at being a kid and the various friends I'd play in the neighborhood in Southwest Minneapolis and so on, and a number of them, I could think of 3 or 4 whose grandparent, usually it was a single grandparent because the other grandparent had died, were living with the family. And these weren't big homes, but they worked out a little grandma's bedroom or whatever it is, and they stayed with the family. You just don't see that now.
yeah,
I mean,
my mom grew up with her maternal grandmother in the home, and she said that it was incredible. It was like having, I don't want to refer to my great grandmother as live and help, but she said the laundry was always done. We always had beautiful 4-course meals on the dinner table every night. And,
Sure. And think of all the knowledge you get from the olden days a little bit, the new days, but what about in between and balancing a discussion and so on?
and the relationship she was able to, the children can have with their elders when
Right.
they live together.
Well,
It's
talk about intergenerational. I mean, that's
Exactly.
really what it is at
Right.
its core is like you were saying, passing on that knowledge, passing on the life experiences. And,
Yeah.
and that's not only did that not happen in my growing up, but my grandparents, they didn't live far away, but they lived far enough that it was that just wasn't what we experienced. I mean, they came around a few times a year for the t-ball games and the dance recitals and piano recitals, and those kinds of things. And it was a very different experience. I mean, I think Angela spent some time with my family recently, and I overheard you and my mom were talking about the experience of my mom talking about her grandmother that I don't remember her talking about before, and I just thought, yeah, those are not experiences that I will tell my children, because that's just not, those are not my experiences. My intergenerational experiences are very different.
Well, he writes in the beginning of the first chapter, he writes about how even growing up, he had no experience with death or exposure to death because he wasn't around seniors. He wasn't around elderly people.
Right.
And I wrote in the margins here, I write, this is why kids need to be part of a house of worship, because of relationships with the elderly.
Right.
Because if you're a young person or a child, if your grandparents don't live nearby, if you're part of a church, you are afforded the opportunity of having relationships with elderly people, and you're exposed to death and dying, because those people from relationships die and they get old, and you go to their funerals, and you see the circle of life, I think, in a really healthy way, and
That's
it normalizes
real
it.
good point. Yeah, really.
So one more reason to raise your children in the church.
That's right. There you go.
You heard it here. You heard it here, folks. But that was actually when I established the foci of this church of being mission driven, intergenerational, and growing, that was actually part of that vision of intergenerational. And I think it actually came from a longing within my own heart about having not had that, but seeing the richness of what this great church offers. And that is, you have these amazing people who come from a different generation who have these rich experiences that they can offer other generations in the pew. And there is a breadth of experience that comes with that. And we could all go around and tell stories of people, but like I remember growing up, and it was Miss Bootsy, and she's like the first person that I remember. And I was thinking about her recently. I was probably right around 5 years old, maybe even 4. And that's like the first significant non-family person who died.
Sure.
But I have memories of what that was like, and going to her memorial service that my father presided or officiated, but there was still those relationships.
So here's a question for you. So when thinking about doing this,
Bob, I'm the one that's managing this conversation.
but do you remember?
This is like trying to run a staff meeting.
So how old were you when you went to your first funeral?
That's the first one I have memories of. So that was like
you're
4 or
about
5.
4 or 5.
I'm sure I went to ones before then, but knowing my family.
Because I was thinking about that too, and I think it was 4. My dad was the youngest of 9 children that lived all this stuff anyway. And one of his siblings passed, and so on. I went to the funeral. But we had friends not too terribly long ago, and I'm 78 in June, who had experiences where they'd never been to a funeral, and they're 50, 60 years old. They just,
Really?
their parents were still alive. They didn't understand that they were never taken to a neighbor's funeral or anything.
See, if you go to the church, you can't help.
I know. I don't know.
You're going to go to someone's funeral,
but
you know.
It just seems like that, so to get used to the idea of a funeral, it's not the end of the world, very
But again, that becomes part of the rhythm of life, and that becomes part of understanding that. I mean, I'm thinking about like your boys will go to your grandmother's funeral. They won't.
I think you're going to say your funeral.
Well, I assume that they will. No, I will not quite, but they probably won't remember that.
Right.
But that will be.
Soren's already been to a funeral, actually.
Yeah.
Andy's grandmother.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
They won't. They won't remember it likely, but but it'll be part of the stories that are told. It would be part of the legend of what that's like to be a part of your family. And just like Miss Bootsy is a part of the stories of my family, because she and her spouse were so significant in the early part of my family's life, key prominent church members, but also just close family friends, and her widow until he passed away was a part of our family, 30 years later, and so I just think about that narrative and what it becomes.
And I mean, I would even add that as as pastors who plan and officiate memorial services a lot, there is a big difference between working with a family who does have attendance at funerals and memorial services as part of their family culture, and they have normalized it, and so they're comfortable speaking that language around, the elements of the service and who might speak in it, versus a family that, is clearly not active, in Christianity or religion, and they clearly probably don't go to funerals or memorial services very often, if ever, and you ask them questions about, what they might want in the service, and they're like a deer in the headlights, and they're like, I don't know, you do it, and so it enables you, by having that, just going to funerals throughout your life, it enables you to actually be a much more active participant in planning services when it comes time for your loved one.
I'm only smiling because I'm sure you've had this experience, but I've walked into the conference room that we share and to meet with families, and you look at them and you start talking about some of those introductory comments, and they have the deer in the headlights look, and you think, this is going to be a long meeting, and you're thinking,
maybe like your friends. But I was thinking the first funeral
I can't imagine being in my 50s.
The first one that I can remember going to, and this is kind of morbid, I was in 3rd grade because my 3rd grade teacher died by suicide.
Oh, wow.
And no jokes about me being her student.
I was going to say.
No.
I was going to wait till we were off air. But
Yeah, isn't that? But at the time, they didn't tell us that she died by suicide. She'd been in a car accident earlier, and they said that it was from the complication of the car accident. I found out years later from my mom. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, on that,
I know, on that
note.
Sorry. Well, it is a conversation about death.
No, exactly. And again, I think I know one of our key goals is to create a conversation and to create an environment where we are more comfortable. Again, it doesn't mean we're going to demystify it in 4 weeks. Angela and I have solved it. No, that, we want to demystify and make death with dignity and a good death a more understandable practice and something that people feel more comfortable talking about. And so in my way of doing that, being able to laugh and be able to bring some levity to it makes it more approachable. People do that differently.
And I would even add living the last season of our lives, with dignity, retaining that control, ultimately leading up to death.
Yeah, if you can't laugh through this.
One crazy little tradition we started, since we're down here most of the year, but we have 4 kids and 10 grandkids and 3 great-grandkids all back in Minnesota. We have to coordinate activities down there, back there. So we always try and get back for Memorial Weekend, because we have most of the whole family is all in this one cemetery. So for years, we were taking at least the 3 youngest grandkids. They were more interested and so on and wanted to come, but they would do the tour through the cemetery and put plants out on the graves and look at the mausoleum where we have now our stone ready, but anyway, all these things, so we're prepared. But it is interesting how that became a tradition, and now they're older, they're finishing high school now, one is, and it makes it interesting that they used to look forward and ask, are we going to the cemetery this Memorial Weekend? It became an event, and then we talked to some of our friends who just lost a couple loved ones, her parents actually, and she'd never been back to a cemetery like that. So basically, Candy's a close friend, we're friends, but Candy took her one day just to spend the day kind of getting used to going back to do it, and then went out to lunch afterwards. But some people just are afraid of going to a cemetery, even at this lady's tender age is 70-ish,
That's interesting. What a great ritual you started with your family.
Yeah, I was going to say, but again, how that becomes a part of the narrative. And I even thinking about the fact that, you have the headstone the marker, but again, helping your grandchildren not be afraid and to say, and to show that at least there's some comfortability there. We know that is where we'll be, that kind of, I mean, I don't know. I think that seems to me that there can be really healthy parts of that, so that people don't have to fear that.
And I think of other cultures, like in Mexico, they have Dia de los Muertos, where they, venerate the ancestors.
Right.
Yeah. So it's
and
just,
welcome that presence.
Right.
Americans are not so great at that.
Yeah, we're like, get away. Yeah. Well, we'll continue this dialogue. And Bob, we're so grateful for your time and the generosity of your wisdom. And next week, we are joined by a nurse, Barbara Converse, who's a member of our congregation, and we'll look forward to her professional experience, but also what personal stories she will bring to the dialogues. We'll look forward to that. And we thank those who are joining us, who have watched and who have listened. And we hope that you will be back with us. Again, each Wednesday during Lent, we have a Clergy Round Table, or at least 4 of the 6 weeks. But we also have a midweek meditation service. And so if you wish to join, we'd love to have you, or you can always catch it online in our archive. But we'll look forward to having you be a part of any of the celebrations of Lent this season at Naples United Church of Christ. We look forward to welcoming you soon.